Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series, Essays on the Gita, with our beloved Ranga. We, of course, are still on Man and the Battle of Life, which we have just begun, actually. The second page, page 48, begins with, "Then, as to human life in its actualities." We have read it already, but now we have to discuss it.
So we will read each sentence and discuss it. He has already told us that life in the physical world is a battle and violence is natural so long as man is not spiritualized. Violence cannot be eliminated in the world. And all attempts to have peace, universal peace in mankind, will not succeed because of man's basic imperfect nature.
So how is this to be achieved in Oroville, which is going to be a universal city and a symbol
They have
of
to
human
all
unity?
rise to the supramental level or by compromise. They have to compromise. There is no other way at this level.
Yes,
There has to be a give and take.
yes.
And they have to find a via media which is acceptable to both. That's the only way. But if both sides take rigid stands, then it's very difficult.
It will be prolonged.
Until sense dawns, and then you realize that the work has to go on, so let's compromise a little bit. Otherwise, it's very difficult.
Mother was not so much for compromise, though.
Compromise in this sense that, of course, if you can't achieve harmony, a via media is a compromise and it starts the work.
No other way.
There's no other way, and then the work gets stalled. It doesn't move. So to get the work moving, you have to have a little bit of a compromise. And he has also told us that so we have to recognize that violence is sure to be there in the physical world of dualities. If there is peace, there is also going to be a disharmony. If there is love, there is going to be hate. So how do you get off these dualities? You have to go to the second level of the spiritual planes of consciousness. But what happens there? The individual may solve his problem, but the collective problem cannot be solved because others are still at a lower level. So this is the problem. What is the permanent cure? You have to go to the third level in the supramental race, and within the supramental race there will be peace and elimination of violence.
And will they control the lower portion?
To a certain extent. But the lowers will still remain. The animals will fight. Human beings at a lower level also will fight because they are not transformed yet. So this is what Rebbe is saying. So now we will. So he says all attempts in the past have failed, and it is bound to fail because of the. That does not mean that you should not make an attempt. All attempts are useful, but perfect harmony and ahimsa, non-violence, is not achievable in the present conditions when man is ignorant. So this one is to accept. Then, as to human life in its actualities, we have to accept its aspect of a struggle and a battle mounting into supreme crisis, such as that of Kurukshetra. The Gita, as we have seen, takes for its frame such a period of transition and crisis as humanity periodically experiences in its history, in which great forces clash together for a huge destruction and reconstruction, intellectual, social, moral, religious, political. And these in the actual psychological and social stage of human evolution culminate usually through a violent physical convulsion of strife, war, or revolution. A very big sentence. And again, Srando is using his style. We have to note he has put 3 words: strife, war, revolution. He always covers all the possibilities in all his texts. So here, it may only be strife, it may be disharmony, it may be an argument of words, or it could be a war only between 2 parties. But it could also be a huge revolution. So all the 3 he has put in grades. We'll see that in all he puts 3 words, sometimes 4 words to show the gradation, all the possibilities. So here it could be just strife, without physical violence. Disagreement.
But
violence of words.
We are seeing such violence in the world today.
Yes.
We have China, we have Russia, Ukraine.
Yes.
We have so many things that China would like to control.
Yes. Again, Taiwan and whatnot. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, the Gita, as we have seen, takes for its frame such a period of transition and crisis as humanity periodically experiences in its history, in which great forces clash together for a huge destruction and reconstruction. If there is destruction, there is also a reconstruction. Again, the dualities: intellectual, social, moral, religious, political. So he has given you again all the gradations. There can be an intellectual destruction of certain past ideas and introduction of certain new ideas.
So religion is covered in that. There can be an upheaval in religion.
But he has included religion also.
Yes.
So intellectual and social, moral, religious, political. Take intellectual. One good example would be new ideas when they come in. Okay, there's a resistance to that. Take in the United States of America, when Charles Darwin discovered evolution, and he said that man has come from the ape. There is great resistance in the Christian world. There are even court cases. So it is only, they have not come to blows, but it's intellectual violence.
Yes.
Then you have social violence. Social violence also, when there is unrest, it becomes social violence. The hijab in Iran is a good example. Okay. Then the racial tension and the civil war in America is a good example also of social. Moral, we can think of, take the tantrics, okay? They defy morality. There also the others don't like them. So there are all these type of revolutions are there. And these religious is a very easy example. The Catholic Church and the Protestant Church.
Yes.
There was a big difference between them and they broke away. And political. So political, we can think of so many different things. But when he's talking of revolution, 2 revolutions come to mind very strongly. The French Revolution, which was social and in a certain sense political also, because the ideas of equality, fraternity and it was a huge conflagration.
Yes.
So many people were killed actually. So, and the Russian Revolution also, the peasants had to revolt against them. And the introduction of communism. So there was a huge revolt. So these are the things that can happen. He's saying that violence is not easy to eliminate. It can be at all these levels: intellectual level, social level, moral level, religious level, political level. And these, in their actual psychological and social stage of human evolution, culminate usually through a violent physical convulsion of strife, war, revolution. There also he has given you 3.
All of them culminate in one of those things.
Yes.
Yes.
These revolutions, the change can come in this way. The Gita proceeds from the acceptance of the necessity in nature for such vehement crisis. So Gita is saying that we will examine this part, okay, and see it's useful. It's necessity in nature. It's very interesting what he says. In the synthesis, he says that if you try to introduce morality, okay, in the synthesis it is there, nature will not allow you, your morality will not work. It can be only, you may pay lip service to it, or you may try to do something, but you cannot make a perfect man out of moral ideals. And he explains why. He says, why? Because nature knows that it's going to fail. So it does not allow. It allows immorality also. So that's what he's saying here also. The Gita proceeds from the acceptance of the necessity in nature for such violent crisis. Nature is essentially made of dualities. And dualities means there have to be both violence and non-violence. And it accepts not only the moral aspect, the struggle between righteousness and unrighteousness, between the self-affirming law of good and the forces that oppose its progression, but also the physical aspect, the actual armed war or other vehement physical strife between the human beings who represent the antagonistic powers. So, is bound to clash so far as man is imperfect. You cannot eliminate violence by your normal methods. It has to be a spiritual power of the highest order to be able to do that.
But that's a very strong statement.
Yes, absolutely.
Antagonistic powers.
And he goes, even more powerful statement is there to come. Okay? So, we must remember that the Gita was composed at a time when war was even more than it is now a necessary part of human activity, and the idea of its elimination from the scheme of life would have been an absolute chimera. Impossible. And it's interesting to note that in all civilizations and all nations, most nations, the idea of the warrior has always been there. In India, we had the Kshatriya idea. Mm-hmm. In Japan, you have the samurai idea. In Europe, we had the knighthood.
Yes.
So everywhere there is the soldiers. Everybody, each one has got an army. Even in our Indian small states, there used to be private armies. Okay? So, people with strength, they are collected, and an army is always necessary. Because the diversity of views may not tally with what you think is right, and if you are an authority, you have to impose your authority, and then force is needed. So that's why it is necessary. And that brings up the interesting question of capital punishment. So, America and India are the only two democracies with capital punishment still existing. Although we are trying to, in both countries, there is a tendency to use it less and less and less. But in Europe, they have abolished it. So, violence individually is one thing, violence collectively is another thing, and violence by the elected government, it's a violence. You are killing someone. So, impossible to eliminate at our normal level. Now he makes that fantastic statement. The gospel of universal peace and goodwill among men, for without a universal and entire mutual goodwill, there can be no real and abiding peace, has never succeeded for a moment in possessing itself of human life during the historic cycle of our progress, because morally, socially, spiritually, the race was not prepared, and the poise of nature in its evolution would not admit of its being immediately prepared for any such transcendence. So, even now, mankind is not prepared at all to eliminate violence. Very clear statement. Has never succeeded. Okay. This is not the place where he discusses the elimination of all these negatives, but in the Life Divine, he has dealt with it. When the supermind comes down, within the supramental race, these negatives will be eliminated. There will be no war, there will be no violence, there will be no disharmony. But the rest of mankind, who are at a lower level, these things will remain. They are not going to be completely changed. It's only in the representative section of the supermind, a few individuals who will have that, and within themselves there will be no war.
Will the lower ones lose some of their power? Will the lower gradations of mankind lose some of their power?
Yes, lose their power. That the supermind will certainly influence the lower, but a complete change is doubtful. When man has come into existence, I suppose some of the animals have benefited by association with men. So similarly, when the yogis are there, man also benefits to a certain extent. If the supramental race is there, Sri Aurobindo says very clearly that there will be a downward influence, not necessarily a total transformation, but a downward influence will be there. Each stage will rise a little bit higher than what it was earlier. He says that. So, he says, has never succeeded for a moment in possessing itself of human life during the historic cycle of our progress, because morally, socially, spiritually, the race was not prepared, and the poise of nature in its evolution would not admit of its being immediately prepared for any such transcendence. And he is including morally, socially, and spiritually also. In fact, even in the spiritual world, okay, we have a variety of ideas which clash. Advaita, Vishishtadvaita, Dvaita, these are all Islam, Christianity. They are at a lower level, they are at a moral level, more or less you can say, or a religious level. But even at the spiritual level, there is disagreement. So all these disagreements will vanish only at the highest level, the supramental level. Level 3, we can say. Okay. Even now, we have not actually progressed beyond the feasibility of a system of accommodation between conflicting interests which may minimize the recurrence of the worst forms of strife. So he is saying, even now we have not actually progressed beyond the feasibility of a system of accommodation. System of accommodation. You are there. Say, hint for Orwell. You have to accommodate. You can use another word, compromise.
And when he wrote this?
100 years ago.
100 years ago. Incredible, huh? Whoa.
Now, what he's saying here is very interesting, because after the First World War, which was a huge conflagration which had never happened earlier to that extent, so mankind woke up to the fact that there has to be peace. They tried the experiment of the League of Nations and failed. Then they have brought in now the United Nations. They changed some of the things, but so long as you have certain countries have rights, it will not work.
Controlling interests.
Yeah, like the Security Council, there are permanent members with a veto. So harmony will never come because of this. In fact, now it is well recognized that United Nations has failed in its duty of imposing war anywhere. Where there are wars all over the world. War in Sri Lanka, war in Iran, war in everywhere. In Iraq. So,
will India get in to the smaller group? Will India get into the smaller group of Russia, United States, China? They're
India.
Speaking about India.
Okay. India's stand is that war, this is not a time for war. So he is appealing to both to stop the war, but he is not supporting either this or that. It is neither supporting Russia nor supporting Ukraine. And when the West insists that no, you should condemn Russia, then the answer that our foreign minister is saying is, why are you imposing your ideas and your will on the rest of humanity? You are saying that because it is your ideas, but there is no necessity for one section of humanity to impose their ideas on others. We have got our own ideas and we will do according to what we want to do. You are using your self-interest, we also will use our self-interest. That's the answer given. But he is being appreciated all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
You were saying about World War One.
yeah, and Second World War also.
Yeah.
They tried with a little change, okay, little more loosening of things, but it has not worked. They have introduced many other organizations, labor organizations, health organizations, UNESCO cultural organizations. There is a section for refugees. There are all for labor, International Labour Organization, ILO, that is also there. And for refugees also there is an organization. But still, it has not succeeded in imposing peace anywhere. So that also is a failure. And towards this consummation, the method, the approach which humanity has been forced by its own nature to adopt is a monstrous mutual massacre, unparalleled in history, a universal war full of bitterness and irreconcilable hatred, is the straight way and the triumphant means modern man has found for the establishment of universal peace. So he's saying, in fact, this is a war to end all wars. That was what was claimed. So we will have peace after this. There will be no disagreement.
And he ends the sentence with an exclamation point.
Yeah. He's saying, it's interesting, isn't it? He's saying, it's a big sentence. And towards this consummation, the method and approach which humanity has been forced by its own nature to adopt is a monstrous mutual massacre. The consummation of peace, okay? What humanity has adopted is a monstrous mutual massacre. The war to end all wars. Unparalleled in history. He is referring, of course, to the First World War and the Second World War. Because this he wrote, maybe the First World War was 1914 to 1918. That was exactly when Sri Aurobindo was writing the Arya. It continued up to, from 1914, it went on up to 1920 for 6 years. And then he stopped. Because the conditions had changed and there was no more necessity of doing that. So, unparalleled in history, a universal war full of bitterness and irreconcilable hatred is a straight way and the triumphant means, look at the language, triumphant means modern man has found for the establishment of universal peace. Let's have a universal war to enforce universal peace. The language is so full of irony.
Monstrous mutual massacre.
Yes. Even in his prose, he uses
alliteration. Yes.
That consummation, too, founded not upon any fundamental change in human nature, but upon intellectual notions, economic convenience, vital and sentimental shrinkings from the loss of life, discomfort and horror of war, affected by nothing better than political adjustments, gives no very certain promise of firm foundation and long duration. So long as you have intellectual ideas of peace and you are using that only for your own convenience and your own self-interest, you'll never be able to achieve peace. That's what he says. Then he says, a day may come, must surely come. There's hope, okay? But not under the present conditions. A day may come, must surely come. We will say, when humanity will be ready spiritually, morally, socially for the reign of universal peace. Meanwhile, the aspect of battle and the nature and function of man as a fighter have to be accepted and accounted for by any practical philosophy and religion. Intellectual philosophy, yes, ahimsa is the best, never succeed in the world. Practical philosophy, you have to accept that war is not going to disappear very easily, and you have to adjust yourself accordingly. And religion also. In fact, religion is the one that has caused maximum wars.
Yes.
The Crusades and the conversions of Islam. Okay, all this was war. They had to impose it by the sword. Yeah, accounted for practical philosophy and religion. The Gita, taking life as it is, and not only as it may be in some distant future, puts the question how this aspect and function of life, which is really an aspect and function of human activity in general, can be harmonized with the spiritual existence. So, this is what the Gita is dealing with. That's what it says. The Gita is therefore addressed to a fighter, a man of action, one whose duty in life is that of war and protection. War as a part of government for the protection of those who are excused from that duty, debarred from protecting themselves, and therefore at the mercy of the strong and the violent. War, secondly, and by a moral extension of this idea, for the protection of the weak and the oppressed, and for the maintenance of right and justice in the world. For all these ideas, the social and practical, the moral and the chivalrous, enter into the Indian conception of the Kshatriya, the man who is a warrior and ruler by function, and a knight and a king in his nature. He has a social function and he must also have a psychological function. Although the more general and universal ideas of the Gita are those which are the most important to us, we ought not to leave out of consideration altogether the coloring and trend they take from the peculiar Indian culture and social system in the midst of which they arose. That system differed from the modern in its conception. To the modern mind, man is a thinker, worker, or producer, and a fighter all in one. And the tendency of the social system is to lump all these activities and to demand from each individual his contribution to the intellectual, economical, and military life and needs of the community without paying any heed to the demands of his individual nature and temperament. The ancient Indian civilization laid peculiar stress on the individual nature, tendency, temperament, and sought to determine by it the ethical type, function, and place in the society. Nor did it consider man primarily as a social being or the fullness of his social existence as the highest ideal, but rather as a spiritual being in process of formation and development, and his social life, ethical law, play of temperament, and exercise of function as means and stages of spiritual formation. Thought and knowledge, war and government, production and distribution, labor and service were carefully differentiated functions of society, each assigned to those who were naturally called to it, and providing the right means by which they could individually proceed towards their spiritual development and perfection. He is giving the European view and the Indian view. This is a very interesting discussion. We can go into details. The Gita is therefore addressed to a fighter. Okay. the man of action. Sri Krishna, the spiritual guru, is talking to Arjuna, the Kshatriya. One whose duty in life is that of war and protection. War as a part of government for the protection of those who are excused from their duty, debarred from protecting themselves, and therefore at the mercy of the strong and the violent. War, secondly, and by a moral extension of this idea, for the protection of the weak and the oppressed, and for the maintenance of right and justice in the world. For all these ideas, the social and practical, the moral and the chivalrous, enter into the Indian conception of the Kshatriya, the man who is a warrior and ruler by function, and a knight and a king in his nature. We'll go into detail. It's a very interesting discussion. Although the more general and universal ideas of the Gita are those which are the most important to us, we ought not to leave out of consideration altogether the coloring and trend they take from the peculiar Indian culture and social system in the midst of which they rose. That system differed from the modern in its conception. So now, to the modern mind, he's talking of the European idea. To the modern mind, man is a thinker, worker, or producer and fighter all in one. There is conscription in most of the Western countries. So conscription means whether you are a carpenter or an artist or a poet, when war comes, you have to come to war. All rolled into one. In India, it wasn't like that. The caste system. Only the Kshatriyas will fight. The others will be protected. It's a much more reasonable way. But what happens in modern times, we'll see. Okay, so he is very clear what he's saying. To the modern mind, man is a thinker, worker, producer, and a fighter. The thinker, in Indian terms, would be the Brahmin. The worker would be the Shudra. The producer would be the Vaishya. And the fighter would be the Kshatriya. So the caste system. All in one. That's the whole thing. Whether you are an artist or not, even if you are an artist, or an administrator, you have to go to war when your nation is plunged in war. Okay? And the tendency of the social system is to lump all these activities and to demand from each individual his contribution to the intellectual, economical, and military life and needs of the community without paying any heed to the demands of the individual nature and temperament. So now we can introduce the idea of the caste system in India. It has become hereditary, but that's a total distortion. The original idea was that man has got basically 4 types of nature. He may be interested in idealism. He may be interested in intellectual problems. He may be interested in knowledge. He would be the Brahmin by temperament. He would be born as such. He could be born to in a low family, but he would be of that character. So the caste system was not hereditary, but by temperament of the human nature. So this is not, the idea is not there in Europe or in the West. Everybody has to fight. So here you are excused from fighting because that's not your function. So we go more detail. Without paying any heed to the demands of the individual nature and temperament. The ancient Indian civilization laid peculiar stress on the individual nature. What is his individual nature? What is his tendency, his temperament? And sought to determine by it the ethical type, the function and place in the society. Nor did it consider man primarily as a social being or the fullness of his social existence as the highest ideal. In the West, the ideal is often social. Socialism is a very fine idea, so far as it went, okay? And everybody must be equal, everybody must have the proper facilities. It's in society that is the most important. In India, the individual was more important, Sri Aurobindo says, because he is considered to be divine. The idea of a human being divine is there inherent in Indian culture. You are the divine. You have to only recover your divinity hidden within yourself. It was not so in the West. In fact, very clearly they say, in Christianity, man is born a sinner, very far from being a divine being. And he can never become the divine. He can have a relation with God, but not a divine.
But it's not the idea of karma in the West.
That's right. That also was not there.
Yeah.
But now it is entering in and filtering in. Karma was not there. Reincarnation was not there. By the way, reincarnation was there in the time of Christ.
Yes, it was.
But when Christianity was organized into a religion 200 years later, it shifted from Rome to Constantinople, present-day Ankara, the capital of Turkey. Then they made a certain setup of rules and regulations and things, and they eliminated reincarnation as being irrational and unrealistic. So he's saying, nor did it consider man primarily as a social being or the fullness of his social existence as the highest ideal, but rather as a spiritual being in process of formation and development, and his social life, ethical life, play of temperament, and exercise of function as means and stages of spiritual formation. He is essentially, the individual is essentially a divine, and he has the right to develop himself fully, and society must provide for the convenience for him to develop. That was the idea. Thought and knowledge, the Brahmin. War and government, the Kshatriya. Production and distribution, the Vaishya, the merchant class. Labor and service, the laborer, were carefully differentiated functions of society, each assigned to those who were naturally called to it, not hereditary. So, the son of a Brahmin could very well be a Shudra, and the son of a Shudra could very well be a Brahmin. It depends on the temperament. But slowly it hardened, like all other things in life. It hardened and crystallized and became fossilized, and the idea of hereditary came in. Heredity came in.
Yeah, heredity.
So, which is a total distortion. Then there's another thing which is also a bigger distortion. There is no hierarchy. The Brahmin, in a way, he is superior to the Kshatriya is superior to the, but they are all different functions of the divine. Idealism and thought, knowledge, you can't say that force is something less. The divine has got consciousness, he has got force, and he has got ananda, and he has got also the humbless. Sat is this material itself. So there can be, all these things can be there. Knowledge, force, wealth, beauty, and splendor. That is the Vaishya's function. To produce wealth and splendor and beauty. And then you have the Shudra, which is misinterpreted as being of a very inferior type.
Lower class.
Yeah,
yes.
And you are even actually degrading him and putting him in his place, which is totally wrong. Okay. Every man has got all these elements in him in different proportions. Nobody is only a Brahmin, nobody is only a Kshatriya, nobody is only a... All these things are there in everybody to a certain extent. And mind you, in India this has been classified, organized, and got distorted later on. But everywhere in the world there is class. Everywhere, you can't deny. Okay? The House of Lords and the House of Commons in England, they have, okay? And they have also, the Lord looked down upon the common people. The plebeian, the royal and the plebeian.
And in America, the upper class and the lower class.
They've looked down on them. Even without the Negroes. Even among the whites, also that difference will be there. I was surprised to know that in Japan, okay, the undertakers are looked down upon. The undertakers, those who deal with dead bodies and burying and everything connected with the funerals. They are looked down upon because a delegation came from Japan of these undertakers, and they were in India, and they said they were looked down upon. So this class, because so far as egoism is there in man, this is bound to happen. But in India, it was classified and made very, very organized way, but mankind is not very receptive to subtleties, and it became degraded. It continues even today. Although we fight it, but it is still there. So, thought and knowledge, war and government, production and distribution, labor and service were carefully differentiated functions in society, each assigned to those who were naturally called to it, and providing the right means by which they could individually proceed towards their spiritual development and perfection. In the ashram also, it was supposed to be a classless society. Okay? But with the passage of time and 75 years gone by and new people coming in, that idea has become a little diluted.
I have a question at the beginning of the paragraph.
Yeah.
The words excused from that duty, debarred from protecting themselves. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, okay. I have understood. Debarred from protecting themselves and therefore at the mercy of the strong and the violent. Okay. So, I'll read the whole sentence. Gita is therefore addressed to the fighter, a man of action, one whose duty in life is that of war and protection. War as a part of government for the protection of those who are excused from that duty, debarred from protecting themselves. Not debarred by law, but debarred by nature. See, an artist would hardly be a boxer or a wrestler. So he is debarred from that violent means. I think he means in that way.
And
so the Kshatriya will protect him.
Excused from that duty?
Yeah. Who are excused from the duty, then you have to apply the idea of the caste system.
Okay.
The Brahmin and the Vaishyas are, and the Shudras are excused from, what's the word he's using? From the, who are excused from that duty of war.
So when Bose built that huge army,
Yeah.
it was all Kshatriyas?
It was all?
Kshatriyas?
Yeah, the Kshatriyas would do all the protection and the war, and the others were not. Now, this is a very interesting concept. Okay, compare the modern warfare and warfare in ancient India. The war would start only between the Kshatriyas. Only the fighting class would come into the picture, and it would start at day on sunrise and end at sunset. It's an absolutely limited only to the Kshatriya class. But today what is it? Midnight also you are bombing civilians. So that idea was there very much in India. And not only that, the two armies, opposing armies, would after night, no fighting. The bugles are blown and there is no war anymore. So they used to visit the opposite camp and even talk with them. In the Ramayana and the Mahabharata it is there. So an ideal, realizing that violence should be limited only to that class and nobody else. Those who can't protect themselves, they should be protected and not forced to protect themselves. But today, the war is 24-hour business. You go on and not only... There are some, the Geneva Conventions tried to bring in some things which, officer has to be treated properly. He cannot be mishandled.
Torture.
Yeah. Yes. Wrong killing.
Yes.
Use of weapons you restrict. Gas should not be used. Landmines should not be used. All these ideas were there. But the violations of these Geneva rules is more common than the observance.
Yes.
But there is an attempt to understand that and try to bring in the idea. Even in India today it has gone. The idea of ancient warfare is gone completely. We have a modern army which is fighting all the time. So we go to the next para. The discussion continues. It's very interesting. The modern idea of a common obligation in all the main departments of human activity has its advantage. The common obligation is going to war when necessary. It helps to greater solidarity, unity, and fullness in the life of the community and a more all round development of the complete human being as opposed to the endless divisions and over specialization and the narrowing and artificial shackling of the life of the individual to which the Indian system eventually led. So he's saying that the European idea allows you to develop more all-round character. An artist should not be effeminate, he should also be capable of war. Okay? And then a Shudra should also be capable of knowledge to a certain extent and production. So he's saying all-round development is that happens in the Western idea. Artificial shackling of life to the individual, to which the Indian system eventually led. But it has also its disadvantages, and in certain of its developments, the too logical application of it has led to grotesque and disastrous absurdities. This is evident enough in the character of modern war, from the idea of a common military obligation binding on every individual to defend and fight for the community by which he lives and profits, has arisen the system by which the whole manhood of the nation is hurled into the bloody trench to slay and be slain. Thinkers, artists, philosophers, priests, merchants, artisans, all torn from their natural functions, the whole life of the community disorganized, reason and conscience overridden, even the minister of religion who is salaried by the state or called by his function to preach the gospel of peace and love, forced to deny his creed and become a butcher of his fellow men. Not only are conscience and nature violated by the arbitrary fiat of the military state, but national defense carried to an insane extreme makes its best attempt to become a national suicide. A little exaggeration is there, but he is saying that this is what it could end it if you take it to its logical conclusion. So it's a very interesting idea. He is comparing the modern system, its advantages and disadvantages. So we'll take it up next time.
Only Sri Aurobindo had that wideness of vision to explain these things. Just thank you, Ranga. Namaste all.